Hello again, biologist from M.Hook's 112 class. We've discussed the mechanisms of evolution and how it occurred. Now we're going to get specific. We're going to start in chapter 16 by looking at plants, fungi, and how they moved on to land. So the ancestors of plants are algae. So algae has to stay in water, and it first evolved over 500 million years ago. Today we've got charophytes. Those are the modern day version of green algae, and we think look very similar to those early ancestors of plants. They probably have an ancestor in common. Okay, so to colonize land, plants had to come up with different adaptations to reduce water loss and to reproduce. So we're going to look at different evolutionary adaptations throughout the different groups of plants. So a plant is a multicellular eukaryote. It's a photoautotroph. So what does that mean? Photo light, auto self, how it gets food. Troph is a food level. So it gets its own energy from light to make food. So it makes sugar, and then through photosynthesis, and then its mitochondria breaks the sugar down into ATP through cellular respiration. So to come on to terrestrial or land habitats, photosynthetic organisms need different resources. They need light to make energy and carbon dioxide for the creation of sugars from carbons, water, and nutrients. So they need to get resources from the air and from the soil. So they have to get it from two different places. So that requires a bit of specialization for each. So you'll have roots that anchor the plant down, and then a top above ground portion. Whereas algae just sit in the water, and this one spot performs all those processes, gets all the resources. To move and be successful on the land, plants need to keep from drying out, they need to get their nutrients, and they need to be able to reproduce. So we're going to look at the adaptations that they use to do so. There's an interesting portion in your book talking about the symbiosis or interaction between species. That's a mutualism where they both benefit. Fungus have association with plant roots, where they can help the plants absorb the nutrients better. That combination of fungus and roots is called mycorrhizae. So the fungi, they help absorb the essential water and minerals from the soil. They get those to the plants, and then they use the sugars that the plants produce. So they're able to use that to make energy. If you plant a plant and it doesn't have any mycorrhizae, it won't be very successful. That was an important thing to have in place so that they could be successful on the land. So there's an example of a mycorrhizal association. What's cool is you can actually have your soil sent out to a lab to see what mycorrhizae you have present. Now that we figured out how plants can get nutrients and water from the soil, we need to understand how they retain the water that they get. Since they're no longer in water, they can dry out, and if they dry out too much, they die. So first, you've got your leaves, right? They're the main portion of surface area for most plants. That's where they do their photosynthesis. So the broader they are, the more light they can get, the more energy they can make. But that means that they can have more water loss. So they have different structural adaptations to help decrease that. First, they have stomata. They're these tiny pores on a leaf surface for gas exchange. Remember when we looked at the different types of photosynthesis, some can close their stomata during the day so they don't dry out. Over most of the plant leaf, you've got a cuticle. That's a waxy layer. So other than the stomata parts, you don't have any water loss leaving there. It's like an oily layer that keeps water in. And then also plants have vascular tissue. In humans, our vascular system is our blood vessels. Here they have a similar kind of thing. They've got vessels, and that brings water and nutrients through the plant. So they get water from the soil and they can bring it up. The two types of vascular tissue, The xylem transports water and minerals up from the roots to the leaves, and then the phloem goes the other direction. It goes from the leaves to the roots so that those parts of the plant that aren't doing photosynthesis can still make energy and do their jobs and survive. So to reiterate, xylem goes roots to leaves, phloem goes the opposite direction, leaves to roots. So here you can see the stomata made up of 2 guard cells. Those are the little holes. Otherwise the rest is cuticle made out of a waxy layer. And there you can see the vascular tissue, the phloem and the xylem, going up to the leaves, sending back down to the roots. So that's what we see when we look at plants, and we can see these little vessel-like looking things on the leaves. Those are vessels. The chloroplasts on this leaf are making sugar and sending it back down to the roots and the rest of the non-photosynthetic cells. And the last thing we have to do is we have to change how they reproduce. Because there's not water, their seeds can dry out and dehydrate. So we need to make sure they're still viable when they find their matching sexual partner and then develop properly. What plants have is they have these protective structures, gametangia. So those are kind of like a little jacket, a little shell that the gamete forms in. Remember, gametes are the sex cells, egg and sperm. So we'll look at different ways that they do this throughout the different plant groups. You'll find out that ovaries are ripened fruit. So when you eat fruit, you're eating ovaries. And if you're allergic to pollen, you're allergic to plant sperm. Let's look at the diversity and history of the plant kingdom. This is going to help us understand the different adaptations that have come up through the different plant systems. We use the fossil records to help tell us about how these things occurred. So we're going to look at bryophytes, ferns, gymnosperms, and angiosperms. And those are going to help solve the problems we talked about before. So the first ancestral plants we found were the bryophytes. So they came from algae, and they're non-vascular. So they don't have a xylem and a phloem, but they do have lignified walls. That means that they've got like woody walls. They've got roots and they've got leaves. And bryophytes are still present today. Examples include mosses, liverworts, and hornworts. Like liverworts here, they're quite small, but they can be in every habitat in the world. Hornworts can be found all over too, except they're usually in damp areas. After bryophytes that were non-vascular, the next step was vascular tissue. And here that lignin, the woody part, is harder. So that's our step up here. But we don't have any seeds yet. And plant evolution was a bit in front of fungal evolution. So fungi were around on Earth in the terrestrial areas about 500 million years ago, barely. And there are very few. It wasn't about until 400 million years ago that there was a lot of fungus. And fungus decomposes everything else down into its nutrients so we can use it again. But that gives us about 25 million years where there weren't very many decomposers at all. So nothing decayed. It just sat there. And these huge amounts of nutrient-rich carbon just sat there and got covered up by the next layers. That's the layer that we dig into to get coal so we can get our fossil fuels. This is called the Carboniferous period because it's carbon-rich. So the conditions to make this would really never come again. So once we run out of our fossil fuels, we won't continue to find more. So we had bryophytes that were avascular, they don't have any vessels. Then we had ferns that have vessels. And the next step that we have are gymnosperms. So gymnosperms evolved seeds. So now you've got the embryo in there that's nice and cozy packaged up with food and protective coverage. But they didn't have any what they're called like specialized chambers. The gymnosperms that are around today are like pine trees. It's like pine cones. Near the end of the Carboniferous, the period we were talking about before, it started getting colder and drier. There, the gymnosperms with their protected seeds were favored, did well, and then they exploded into lots of different species. They were very successful. Today, we've got conifers, those pine trees, the cone-bearing plants, are gymnosperms. So here's a nice view of the Carboniferous, where you've got lots of ferns. Fun fact, we had more oxygen in our air at this time, so insects could get really big and still have enough oxygen to fuse through. So that dragonfly there, a meganeura is what it's called, those could get to be up to like 30 inches. So that's almost 3 feet. They're the largest insect that can fly. The pine cones that we see are actually the female portion. This is the male portion of the pine tree, and that basically makes pollen. The next adaptation that we saw was flowers. So angiosperms are flowering plants. And they make flowers, and they have their seeds and ovaries. Angiosperms were very successful. They are now the great majority of living plants. Over 250,000 species. Most of all we get our food from angiosperms. Wood, conifers, gymnosperms, food, angiosperms. So angiosperms, now they can enclose their seed within an ovary or a fruit, whereas gymnosperm seeds are naked. Fruit is just a ripened ovary that helps protect the seed, increases seed dispersal or helps it spread, and is a major food source for animals. So we do seed dispersal in several ways. They can have different strategies. You can have wind dispersal, like in milkweed. You can have burrs that stick to animals that they can get transported to new areas, or even the ingestion by animals. That way, they eat it, they move to another area, and they defecate, and it spreads. Some seeds are dependent on animals eating them and having them go through the digestive system to make the seed coat on the outside get worn away so that water can get into the embryo and it can develop. A fun thing about conifers, the pines, is that some of them are reliant on fire. They need to heat up before they can open and develop fully. So just to reiterate, gymnosperms and angiosperms in agriculture and what we use them for. We use gymnosperms for lumber, angiosperms for food, and like we use them for decoration with flowers, medications, and perfumes. So there's a nice summary looking at the different diversity that we talked about and what adaptations you see present in each group. So this is a nice phylogenetic tree showing how, as we move on, we've got all vascular plants here, we've got seeds, and flowering plants. Next, let's talk a little bit about fungi. So fungus is an important portion of an ecosystem. What they do is they're the decomposers, so they help get nutrients back into the soil. And in the case of mycorrhizae, that fungus to plant root associations, those help the plants to absorb minerals and water that they need from the soil. So fungi, they're eukaryotes, generally multicellular, and are actually more closely related to animals than plants. Some examples of fungi can be shown here. You can have a fairy ring. So the fungus actually lives underground. And when it reproduces, it shoots up these fruiting bodies in the shape of the fungus. So check for one of those around. You should be able to find them. Other examples, yeast, fungus that's predating upon a roundworm, mold, orange fungus in a forest, wooded area. And as I briefly discussed, fungus are decomposers. Along with bacteria, they help recycle nutrients. They make them available again for plants to use and grow, for us to then eat and grow with as well. And then once animals get broken down, they go back into the soil. Otherwise, that cycle would be a straight line and we'd run out of nutrients. And thus ends chapter 16.